having a criminal record isn't a shining point on the resume of a potential presidential candidate. However, in the case of Myanmar Burmese rights activist Aung San Suu Kyi, in fact, the 10 years she spent in prison for fighting against the military junta leading Myanmar gave her a reputation as a democratic activist and human rights leader across the world. According to the China Morning Sun on January 17, 2016, earlier this year, Myanmar witnessed its first democratic elections in nearly 5 decades, and the party led by Suu Kyi, the Democratic National League, or DNL, swept 80% of parliamentary seats. However, according to Reuters of January 16, 2016, despite this success, Suu Kyi herself is prevented from assuming the role of president because of a constitutional amendment preventing people like her, who have been married to or born from foreigners, from assuming the role of presidency. However, Kyi is quoted in the New York Times of January 21, 2016, as saying, despite this barrier, she is effectively ruling the presidential party, that her party has given her a role above president, and she will continue to manage the party as if she had presidential power. And considering that the success as Suu Kyi as a democratic leader could either thrust Myanmar back into political turmoil or create a political renaissance of unprecedented democracy, we must ask the question, is the military government going to let Aung San Suu Kyi be Myanmar's president? And the answer is yes, because Suu Kyi is proving that she is willing to make enormous concessions to military power. And we can see why this is the case, first, by seeing how she is prominently including military officials in her new administration. Second, the military will still remain an amazing degree of autonomy. And finally, by the fact that Suu Kyi is courting the military's international allies. In the nearly 1,000 years of documented history of Myanmar, only 14 have been under a democratic regime. So there is an enormous amount of burden facing Suu Kyi as the leader of Myanmar. As a result, she needs to make a careful balance between military leaders and her new government, which is why she has clearly made a strategic decision to include enormous numbers of Myanmar former military members in her new administration. According to Politico of February 1st, 2016, it is written into Myanmar's constitution that in order for the military to accept any other form of government, the military needs to have at least a quarter of parliamentary seats, a constitutional veto, and control over 3 security administrations. Clearly, this is an enormous amount of power, but Suu Kyi is going above and beyond what's mandated by the Constitution, because according to the New York Times of January 2nd, 2016, in her own cabinet, she has handpicked several former military leaders on top of the number mandated by the Constitution. Thus, she is clearly willing to keep a lot of old faces around in order to compromise her vision of democracy with a stable one, creating a stable government that could successfully pass a constitutional amendment that would let her formally assume the presidency. Many people who voted for Suu Kyi within Myanmar view her as almost a saint. Others voted for her simply because anyone seemed better than the military. But for people who were hoping for a radical change in military control, it likely won't happen in the near future under Suu Kyi's control, because in order to assume the presidency, Suu Kyi is already maintaining enormous amounts of military autonomy throughout the country. According to the Washington Post of February 2nd, 2016, essentially, the government and the military can operate completely separately, as military members do not take any commands from the president, only from the commander-in-chief of the military. The aforementioned New York Times explains that in Myanmar, the military is able to control everything from civic administration down to the village level, as well as receive funds far beyond those allocated by the government budget. It also controls policing as well as domestic espionage. As a result, Suu Kyi is clearly willing to preserve this autonomy for the military. So for the many Myanmar people who were hoping that they would no longer be living under military control, life might not actually change much even within this democratic framework. However, by showing that the military and a democratic government can coexist, even with a lot of compromise, it will give Suu Kyi the support she needs from military leaders to formally assume the presidency. The final reason that Suu Kyi will successfully attain the military support as president is that she is already making more concessions on an international level, by courting the support of individuals and nations that already are backing the military. For nearly the last 50 years, one of the largest international supporters of the military junta that led Myanmar was China. And according to the China Morning Sun of January 15, 2016, many people assumed that when Suu Kyi got power, she would immediately pivot to make more close economic and political ties with European nations and the United States. However, these people have been proven wrong. According to The Economist of February 2, 2016, Suu Kyi appears to be very aware that in the past, China has helped and supported several government military coups that have overthrown unpopular leaders. So, she has actually made no contact at all with any Western leaders, but has accepted 3 Chinese diplomats to come and converse with her new administration. While this may be compromising the democratic values and hopefully Westernization that many of her supporters want, she is, however, currying favor with a powerful ally, and by maintaining China's important role as a political and economic influence within Myanmar, she's likely to avoid upsetting the military. As a result, by making slow reforms, and in many cases undermining the very democratic values that got her elected, Suu Kyi seems like she will actually be able to successfully take on the role of presidency, while it may not be with all of the original promised reforms, by showing that the military can coexist within a democratic framework. It may be the baby steps that Myanmar needs to eventually progress towards a more democratic and fair system. Returning to the question, will Myanmar's military allow Aung San Suu Kyi to be president? The answer is yes, because Suu Kyi is making enormous concessions to military power. First, by putting military leaders in her own administration. Second, by not attacking their autonomy in the country. And finally, by courting their international allies. 10 years under house arrest taught Myanmar and Suu Kyi a lot of lessons about what it takes to lead a country. But working with the military is the key to staying there.
All right.
First of all, really good speech.
Thank you.
So some questions. First, in your first point, you essentially said she's incorporated the military into her government. How does that allow her to still be president? Won't that allow them to overrule her rule?
Well, I think that the key is showing that her administration, the DLN, can coexist with military leaders. So it depends what you mean in the sense that absolutely some of her policies will likely be pushed aside as a result of this military influence. However, because they're working within her framework in which her party is leading, essentially the military is being forced to make unprecedented concessions at the same time.
Cool. Going off of that, you explained how she's given the military and allowed the military to have a lot of the rights they already had and the ability to govern a lot of things. So doesn't that essentially prevent her party from actually ruling?
Well, in terms of whether she has the technical presidency, I think it's a step in the right direction. In terms of those people who voted for Suu Kyi hoping that her rule and her democratic ideals would reign supreme, I mean, it's not a positive sign because absolutely she will have to cave. But as a result, her formal leadership and her role as presidency will probably be more secure because of that.
Mm-hmm. And then one final question. Can you explain a little bit more how pivoting to China will establish her legitimacy in the role of president?
Well, it's because it's not a pivot to China, it's actually a maintenance of the status quo. Because China has been such a large supporter, one of the most dangerous things she could do to shake up both the military's role in the country and the people that have kept them in power is to move away from China. And she's clearly treading very carefully on breaking that ice. So essentially, by keeping her relationship with China, she's trying to make sure that the military still feels increasingly comfortable in their role in the country.
All right, no further questions.
Thank you.